thank you very much. And I'm so sorry, I did have technical difficulties because I had disabled video function on all apps on this phone. But now I figured it out. Thank you so much, and thank you to Patrick. I'd asked him to talk about the Great Depression 2.0 and what he thought about that. So I'm going to concentrate on talking about borders. And thank you to everyone for joining today and for being here for our Zoominar, Borders, COVID-19 and the Global Depression 2.0. I must get my clock going. I'm going to talk for 10 minutes exactly. Coronavirus is a very emotional issue and very anxiety producing for many people, including myself. So it's been quite difficult to actually try to think through this rationally. And here's my stopwatch, okay. But because of all the fear and anxiety and uncertainty about the virus and the reaction to the virus and the global depression, both the economic depression and the mental health issues associated with this time, you know, it's easy to feel very paralyzed and for the brain to be paralyzed. And as I said, I'm very much part of that. But I think it's very important to try to talk about this as dispassionately and simultaneously as compassionately as possible. So I'm going to try to do that. Thanks to Pier Paolo, he explained already this was part of our special issue that we had launched just a few weeks before the arrival of COVID-19. And so we wanted to use this chance to talk about what has happened in the last 4.5 months since we spoke about what the situation was in December 2019 around borders and globalization. But before diving in, I would like to point out, following on from what Patrick has already said about inequality, that our ability to meet on Zoom is of course part of our privilege as people who can afford to access the internet, of which many, many people in the world cannot. And like all other inequalities, the digital divide between those with internet and those without has become more entrenched in this time. And perhaps later Bruce might want to speak to that as well. At the beginning of this pandemic, I'm sure you saw the many headlines which announced in a very Pollyanna-ish style that we are all in this together and coronavirus is the great equalizer, et cetera, but I disagree wholeheartedly with those assessments. And I think that inequality is really one of the major takeaways from the last few months. If you're in a place which currently has a lockdown or shutdown or a shelter-in-place order or a stay-at-home directive, then we of course remember all the people who do not have homes or safe homes. There's been an incredible amount of domestic and child abuse in this time also. And so if you can weather this pandemic in relative comfort, then you are indeed relatively privileged in relation to the majority. Social distancing is of course also a privilege reserved for those with adequate space. Many people are shut into shacks. 1 in 6 South Africans, for example, where we are right now, 1 in 6 people live in a shack, and many of them live in the shack with dozens of other people. School children cannot remote learn if they don't have internet access. And many people do not have the finances to stop working for so long. And many low-income jobs cannot be performed from home. So I think that really COVID-19 has revealed deep inequities and threatens to foment greater inequalities still. Definitely low-income people everywhere, especially with the spatial differences between low-income areas and higher-income areas, they will suffer much more from this disease. And those economic differences are oftentimes mapped onto racial and ethnic differences too, and sometimes also religious. So it's a bit of a depressing time if you work like myself on inequality. Meanwhile, there is a current struggle globally between those in favor of quote unquote opening the economy and those who are in favor of continued lockdowns. And this is quickly becoming polarized into a conservative versus progressive debate and has created a new cultural border between people. As we had laid out in the abstract for this Zoominar, the response to this global pandemic has been to close borders and also erect new ones. Border thinking is absolutely on steroids right now, very powerful steroids. In the special issue, the border refers not only to territorial borders, but also to a heterogeneity of social and cultural boundaries, as I allude to above. But we have seen right now that nation states are literally slamming shut their territorial borders in very dramatic fashion. They have been for the last couple of months. So on one hand, the nation state seems to be coalescing and unifying behind their closed borders. But within nations, as we can see with the US, the different states, or within many countries, the different provinces, we are also witnessing the nation fracturing as borders between regions and provinces are closed. As we point out in the intro to the special issue, a border is by its nature JIAS-based and thus both inclusionary and exclusionary. The aim is to exclude possibly infectious outsiders and keep the people on the inside safe as we create new borders, both metaphorical and literal, with the perpetual talk of epicenters, clusters, superclusters, and hotspots. So of course, all this closing of borders has already proven to be a feel-good fallacy, as the virus is already everywhere. Those on the inside and outside are infected. So we should view this border thinking as a simplification meant to apportion responsibility and reduce accountability for local, regional, national governance structures. As is abundantly obvious by now, neither of the world's two superpowers, China and the US, or even bodies like the EU or organizations like the beleaguered World Health Organization, have managed to spearhead a cross-border global response to what is quite widely described as a global pandemic. Also, if the disease is not under control everywhere, it is not under control anywhere, as all borders are somewhat porous. So one of the questions I wanted to ask then is, what then is the future of globalization with all these closed yet porous borders? And before answering that question, I want to point out a very dangerous trend which is in vogue right now. If I were to answer that question from the vantage point of today or the last 2 months, I would proclaim something like globalization has been killed by coronavirus, or COVID-19 is the last nail in the coffin of globalism. But the dangerous trend I'm referring to is the narrativization of this crisis. Commentators and political actors from across the political spectrum narrativize the coronavirus pandemic as a quote-unquote temporal break, as in the myriad headlines and pronouncements that the world will never be the same again, this is a black swan event, this is the new normal, etc. I think we should be very careful about that narrativization, because that narrativization of the crisis as a temporal break between a before and after accomplishes ideological agendas, which is not only hubristic, because for thousands of years, humankind has faced plagues and epidemics, but it also allows people with a myriad of agendas. Climate change activists think this will be the moment when everyone realizes the necessity of a Green New Deal. Anti-globalization nationalists view this as the moment when they can close borders to migrants or refugees forevermore. It allows all of them to take advantage of the current moment to further their respective political agendas. So whether you agree or not with those agendas, it's just a point to be noted. The dangers of declaring a temporal break are defined well in Helga Jortheim's work on Reinhard Koselleck's notions of time and periodization. So declaring a temporal break, like 9/11, for example, a very dangerous temporal break that was declared and many things happened in the wake of that, allows us to proceed as if there was no before, as if coronavirus has suddenly come upon us and we discover that the world is very unequal, that democracy is practically non-existent, and many people's finances are extremely precarious, or that there are a lot of borders. But are we really in a temporal break? I would say it's too soon to say, because we have to consider what came before. In the 30 years prior to this, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we were already seeing harder and harder borders arising everywhere. What is important to remember is that the steroidal border thinking we are witnessing now is the continuation and intensification of a trend scholars had already identified at the end of 2019. On the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, last November, 9 November 2019, the occasion for our special issue that Pier Paolo referred to, and so did Patrick, there were more borders than ever before. And not only that, there were more borders and more xenophobia on the rise around the world. So although coronavirus, and more specifically the government and state responses to it, have shown how fragile democracy is, that too is part of a trend we were already witnessing in the last decades. Right-wing authoritarian leaders are now using this crisis to accrue even more power, especially we've seen that with Viktor Orban in Hungary, who can now rule by decree. Ethno-nationalism, racism, white supremacy, isolationism, populism, protectionism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and religious fundamentalism, which were all increasing already, are going to increase even more. In that sense, we are seeing a continuation and exacerbation. Now we have several examples of xenophobia. Everyone is blaming the other for the virus. Trump, who is one of the most ardent traffickers in xenophobia, keeps referring to the Chinese or Wuhan virus. And Chinese and Asian people are suffering xenophobia in many countries because of such feelings. But meanwhile, the Chinese in China are victimizing African migrants as carriers of COVID-19. In India, Hindu nationalists are blaming Muslims, and I could really go on all day on how this crisis is being used to make the other more other. And it's, again, a very dangerous trend. But I will return instead for the last minute of my time to question the globalization's future amidst all these currently closed borders. Ironically, our contemporary pre-COVID-19 and during COVID-19 preoccupation with borders and walls is the result of the deglobalization of the last years. Deglobalization is examples are the backlash against globalization, like Brexit, Trump's election, Trump's border wall, etc. But that is also ironically a global phenomenon. So deglobalization is in fact global. When we see prognosticators prognosticating that the coronavirus pandemic is supposed to be the end of globalization, e.g. international supply chains for the production of medicine will change, the destruction of air travel and tourism, etc., closing borders, this pandemic has reminded us more than ever how interconnected and interdependent we are. Almost every single country is affected by the virus, and there's a global competition to develop the vaccine and to acquire personal protective equipment, testing reagents, etc. Countries are trying to learn from each other about best practice for battling the infection's transmission rate and how to keep the R0, the reproduction rate of the virus, under 1, etc. More than ever before, coronavirus is a global media event. The global middle classes, those people with reliable broadband, are all watching Tiger King on Netflix and playing Animal Crossing all together, etc. So there's a global consciousness around the disease, and many millions of people have comparable experiences. So in a sense, it's forming a generation and forming a global experience. So even if coronavirus leads to some more deglobalization, we will all be deglobalizing at the same time, so it will still be a global phenomenon. So the jury is still out on whether this is more globalization or less. In conclusion, I will say that because we know so little about this virus or its trajectory, and here, unfortunately, I'm referring to all of us in the world, including the scientific community of virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists, etc., I would say that we should all be cautious about making declarative statements about the present. As Paolo said, we finished our introduction with who the hell knows what will happen next, and does anyone now dare pretend to know what will happen? I'll just say 2 last examples of how crazy things have been, and maybe Bryonny would like to talk to this also. The arch Brexiteers who advocated for the UK to withdraw from the EU for years, predicated on the notion of taking back control of the country's borders, did not close their borders like so many other countries during this time. And as far as I know, they still have not closed the borders. I think people now have to be quarantined upon arrival, but meanwhile, they did not close the borders to non-citizens like so many other countries, but within the UK, this is causing even more instability as the different countries, the 4 different countries of the UK have got different lockdown policies. And finally, with the global depression 2.0 really upon us, I mean, who can afford to keep their borders closed for too long? Italy has had to decide that they're going to open their borders from 3 June for tourism, because tourism is a huge part of the global economy, and any sort of global economic recovery will likely require border openings. So there's a current struggle going on. And perhaps there's a temporal aspect to this as well, that the closing of borders in the initial stages of the pandemic represented good governance, right? We've closed our borders, we're protecting our citizens. As I said, this is a specious argument, but that was what was made. But perhaps as we move forward living with this virus, which the World Health Organization says will be with us for at least 5 years, opening borders will come to be a badge of honor or a sign of success at controlling the pandemic. It could be, we'll find out. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Paolo. Back to you.